Imagine for a moment that you are a regular civilian within the Marvel Universe, no supernatural abilities of any kind, but you decide that you want to do a little bit more. Maybe for heroism, maybe for villainy, regardless, you just want superpowers of any kind. And therefore, you decide to become a Warlock. No, not that Warlock. No, not that Warlock either. Okay, Marvel has two characters named Warlock, and neither of them are Warlocks, like in the Dungeons & Dragons sense. The way that I mean Warlock for today's purposes is someone who gains supernatural ability through a deal or pact with a strong, magically powered entity. That kind of Warlock. As I said, the Dungeons & Dragons definition. Basically, you want to be like Doctor Strange, but without all of that pesky learning. And fear not, there are options available to you, near instant tickets to a power boost, though not ones that come free of risk. And some of these tickets relate to beings known as the Octessence. You might not know the name Octessence immediately unless you are deep in the scene of Marvel magic already, but I guarantee you that you know at least one character who channels the power of these beings, the Juggernaut. Yeah, despite being a mutant villain primarily, Juggernaut is a magic character. The idea of getting Juggernaut powers through a relatively simple Warlock deal is probably enough of an intro hook already, so we'll get started. Without further ado, let's talk about the magical entities known as the Octessence, learning about the foundation of Marvel's magic system in the process, and also why you maybe should not touch that system if you value your own life. Let's begin with the basics. Who, or perhaps what, are the Octessence? This is kind of a straightforward question, but this is also a magic thing, so there are two ways that I can answer it. The publication answer is something that I briefly mentioned in the intro. Originally, the Octessence were just kind of names. They were random, magic-y sounding words that Doctor Strange would invoke for his spells all the way back in his first comics from the early 1960s. Also, an elephant in the room for the D&D people. I know I'm kind of using D&D terms in this video with the whole Warlock bit because those are pretty well understood in the modern day, but also Doctor Strange, Sorcerer Supreme, uses Warlock-like abilities on occasion that he learned through research and study like a wizard. You're just gonna have to accept that Marvel does not use the same magic classification system that Dungeons & Dragons does, because Doctor Strange comics predate the publishing of D&D by over a decade, so, oh well. That aside, the general term that Marvel uses for magical entity invoked in the use of a spell is Principality. There are a lot of Principalities, way more than the 8 of the Octessence, and most of them are pretty random and irrelevant. You have Ikthalon, you have Munapor, you have Denak. One of them is called Patootie, apparently. Even I don't know what's up with that one. I found that name buried in the annals of a Marvel handbook from 2009, just kind of listed alongside a lot of other names that I assume have been mentioned once and then never again. But this kind of thing is treated as canon, so I guess people in Marvel are just invoking the power of Patootie for some unknown reason. I'll put the entire list that I found on screen here, and we can do one of those tag yourself memes. Which of the obscure Marvel Principalities are you? Getting back on topic, Principalities were not really characters for the first few decades of Doctor Strange. They were just kind of weird beings that existed, but rarely if ever actually showed up on the page. One or two would occasionally show up as villains of the week, and a 1992 arc called War of the Seven Spheres showed us the Principalities as a collective, but they rarely had any wider impact. This would change in 1999, though, when writer Kurt Busiek decided to actually do something with them. Thus, in a very weird little mini crossover called The Eighth Day, we were introduced to the Octessence, and now I can talk about them in terms of lore. The Octessence are a group of 8 extra-dimensional entities, and in terms of, like, what they actually are, that is the best unifying description I can give you. The Octessence are not connected by being the same type of entity. Different members of the group have been described as gods or demons. One of them is just a sentient mass of energy, and another used to be mortal before gaining so much magical power that he ascended and became a principality in his own right. The factor that actually caused the Octessence to come together, then, is a set of shared goals and motives. Those goals are being the best, and those motives are, hating each other. Yeah, these beings are not friends, or even allies, really. Millennia ago, the entities that would become the Octessence knew of each other vaguely, and got into an argument over which of them was the strongest. This argument then spiraled so much that the 8 of them entered into a wager that would eventually answer that question, becoming what is basically an extra-dimensional fight club known as the Octessence. Of course, in true magical nonsense fashion, the Octessence weren't going to fight each other directly. Instead, they were going to choose champions, ascended warriors empowered with various abilities, and then they could handle all the bloody fighting nonsense while the Octessence just kind of watched from the heavens like they were Pokemon trainers. To choose their warriors, each principality created a magical artifact and shot it down to the chosen battlefield of Earth. Whichever human touched it first would be imbued with magical energy, becoming a being known as an exemplar, which for practical intents and purposes is really kind of just a D&D warlock. This was all happening thousands of years ago. Extra-dimensional beings don't need to operate on human timescales, and so most of these artifacts just kind of sat around in special temples, maybe protected by a cult or whatever, for a very long time. But there was a failsafe in place in that whenever the first exemplar artifact was taken, the others would put out a sort of fate or destiny aura or something, drawing hosts directly to them. So once one artifact was picked up, the contest would truly begin. This is what the 8th Day crossover is about. One of the exemplars, really the second exemplar, we'll be coming back to that, is awakened, causing all of the others to shortly awaken and Earth to be plunged into chaos. At least theoretically, that was the goal. If everything had gone how the Octessence wanted it to, the exemplars would have worked together at first, casting a ritual over the entire planet which would have mind-controlled every human, divided them into 8 factions, each under one exemplar, and then instead of just the exemplars fighting in a big arena battle, there would be a planet-wide war between the 8 new groups, which is insane. Obviously, they didn't win. Thank Khonshu I'm a lore channel and not a comic recapper channel, because the 8th Day itself is kinda boring. They set it up to be this big impressive thing, but in reality the exemplars just appear and then get beaten up by a couple of superheroes, and then the whole thing is over in just a couple of issues. But even in these few issues, we do get fascinating lore, hence the rest of the video. Right at the end, the exemplars are actually freed from the direct control of the Octessence. When each member individually touched their artifact, they kind of became a pawn to these beings, but with enough willpower, it was proven that they could overcome their new magical masters and keep the powers in the process. So this apparently is a pretty nice way to get incredible magical abilities almost instantly if you're willing to take the risk. You can just align yourself with a member of the Octessence, be empowered by them, and then if you keep serving their goals, they will keep giving power to you. But with enough will, you can break away from them and do whatever you want. Plus, anybody who is magically trained enough can still use the spells invoking the Octessence. We'll go over why exactly that's the case later, but the point of all this is to say that the Octessence powers are easily accessible. Well, easily accessible relative to magic weirdness. So now that you understand why I refer to them as Warlock patrons, let's go over each member of the Octessence individually, talking about what they are like, what powers they can provide, and how safe or unsafe it may be to make a deal with them. We'll go over them in order from least to most relevant, so beginning with the member that has appeared the least and ending at the Juggernaut one, Cyttorak. I'm not even gonna pretend that the Juggernaut one is not by far the most important. This means that the first member of the Octessence we will be going over is... Oh god, why did I decide to do it in this order? Okay. The first member of the Octessence we will be going over is named Balthakk. B-A-L-T-H-A-K-K, Balthakk. I know what it sounds like. I didn't write it, so you can't blame me. All that we really know about Balthakk's nature or history is that it is an energy being. It's only appeared on panel a handful of times, and it just looks like energy, the classic Kirby crackle pattern of dots that is usually used in comics to represent cosmic weirdness, which means that yes, Balthakk does kinda just look like a bunch of balls. The domain that Balthakk rules over is guessable from it being an energy creature. It is a god of energy, specifically described often as heat or fire, but also this is done in a really strange way that I still don't fully understand. Balthakk's exemplar is one of the first to arise, and her name, when empowered, is Inferno. Inferno has cool magic energy abilities. She can fly around and she can shoot blasts and such, but her blasts are like beams of purplish pink light, and yet everyone in the comic always calls it fire. This happens many, many times. Her name is Inferno, the artifact that empowered her is called the Blinding Brazier of Balthakk. Everyone refers to her abilities as fire-based. But it's not. That's not fire. I don't really know what's going on here or have a good answer for you. Like I said, we are starting with the worst and least relevant members of the Octessence so that I can end the video at a more exciting point. Balthakk just kind of has like heat and energy and I guess fire powers. There really is only one reason that you might know the name, and that is that Balthakk's iconic spell used by other characters is pretty well known. The Bolts of Balthakk is a spell that you might have seen Doctor Strange or any other number of magical characters use in plenty of different media, but even that is very straightforward. It's an energy bolt. It is basically the Eldritch Blast of the Marvel Universe. Anybody can whip out the Bolts of Balthakk for a basic attack whenever they need it, making Balthakk just kind of straightforward. Also, his name is Balthakk, and I've had to say Balthakk more times in this one section than any other time in my life, and I'm ready to be done with it, so let's move on. Next up, we have Raggador, where things get more interesting immediately. Balthakk was pretty simple. If you just want to shoot stuff and blow things up, go be a Warlock of Balthakk. But if you want to get a lot more complex, maybe check out Raggador, as this one appears to be the god of machinery. Raggador bestows his empowered with the ability to near instantly create tools or weapons for practically any purpose, usually by carving them out of nearby stone, which leads to some pretty cool aesthetics. Raggador's exemplar, a guy named Stonecutter, is perhaps the most important to the original Octessence plan, as this was the guy building a magical machine that was supposed to mind control all of humanity. So evidently, if you give Raggador's empowered enough time to work, they can do some pretty crazy things. The downside of this is that things do still have to be built. Raggador's exemplar can make tools near instantly, but complex machinery still takes time. This is one of the main reasons why the exemplars lose. The great machine just takes too long to be completed. As for the other powers that Raggador can provide, he seems to have a secondary theming around rings, though you wouldn't be able to tell this from his visual design at all. Raggador's exemplar artifact is called the Ringed Ruby, and his most known spell is simply the Rings of Raggador. What does the Rings of Raggador spell actually do, though? Unfortunately, the best answer that I have for you is a lot, and I can't get more specific beyond that. On the page, it is a binding spell, and not the only binding spell you will see in this video, but supposedly it can do more? A Marvel handbook which deals heavily with magic talks a lot about the different spells that characters use, and the section on the Rings of Raggador says that it has many applications, quote, listed below, and that it doesn't list anything below. I don't know why they wrote it like this. I will say, though, it being a versatile spell does make sense with Raggador's theme, at least. To go back to D&D terms, Raggador is the being that you go to if you want to kind of be a Warlock Artificer multiclass. He can make tools and weapons, and his spell can be used in a variety of different situations. We don't know what those situations are, but it's magic, machinery, techie. You get the vibe, if nothing else. Though, even as I say that, I do have to acknowledge that the vibe doesn't always make sense. A more recent comic showed us an artifact called the Reeds of Raggador, and this is like a revival charm. If you're holding a Reed of Raggador when you die, it will bring you back to life, albeit very, very painfully. That's not a machine thing, but whatever. And one more fact about Raggador and his exemplar specifically before we move on. This is Stonecutter, the exemplar. I showed you a picture of him earlier. he is supposed to be 17. Like, before he picked up the artifact, he was a kid. So I don't know what exactly the Ringed Ruby of Raggador does to people who grab it, but apparently it changes you pretty significantly. Moving on, we have a nice change of pace in a member of the Octessence who actually does things directly. This is Ikonn, and rather than just being a name that Doctor Strange shouts out, this is actually a villain that Strange has fought. What exactly Ikonn is has never been explicitly stated on the page, but from context, I'm going to guess that he is some sort of psychic or perhaps nightmare-based entity, supported by the fact that we do explicitly know what his domain is. Ikonn is the Master of Madness. Ikonn's signature spell is, ironically, pretty straightforward. It is simply called the Illusions of Ikonn, and it does exactly what you think it does. It's an illusion spell. This is also a great time for me to point out that Doctor Strange in the MCU uses a bunch of these signature Octessence spells. This fight against Thanos, where he makes a bunch of clones of himself, that's the Illusions of Ikonn. Ikonn's exemplar artifact is called the Ivory Idol of Ikonn, and when it was picked up, it transformed its wielder into the being known as Bedlam. Bedlam is extremely powerful. She is a telepath and mind controller, apparently strong enough that her mere proximity kicked Professor X out of the astral realm as soon as she arrived. So you might be thinking, ooh, illusions and psychic magic, that's very cool, I want to go be a Warlock of Ikonn. But unfortunately, this is also one of the Octessence members that comes with the most drawbacks to it. Bedlam is insanely powerful, yes, but she's not a normal psychic. She is strong because she is channeling energy from a god of madness, and this means her mind is all chaotic and twisted and generally messed up. Bedlam's power is so uncontrolled that she is essentially unable to communicate in any form. Technically, she can communicate, but merely getting information conveyed to you by Bedlam in any way hurts. This even applies to her allies. There are multiple scenes where other exemplars working with Bedlam try to talk to her and then immediately bail out because even a simple conversation is a psychic attack. Remember, I said Bedlam's proximity to Professor X was enough to kick him out of the astral plane? That's because merely being around her makes the psychic realm chaotic and unstable. This does track given Ikonn's whole thing, though, as he is one of the more actively evil members of the Octessence. Sure, none of them are really good guys, they were going to enslave all of humanity for their own ends, but that is more of an eldritch, not caring about beings beneath them thing more than intentional malice. Meanwhile, Ikonn has actively tried to take over Earth before. His first appearance is basically a horror movie plot. A bunch of college students stumble upon this cursed artifact called the Bell of Ikonn, and by ringing it, they begin summoning the psychic entity into our world. Doctor Strange goes to stop him, of course, but over the course of the fight, he does say, quote, "If Ikonn is allowed to reign over the world, then illusion would become as fact," which is scary, but pretty cool. So, should you become a Warlock of Ikonn? No, not really recommended. You get some pretty cool powers, but I do not think the drawbacks are worth it in the slightest. Though as we transition away from Ikonn, that gives me a great opportunity to sidebar and address why exactly the powers of these beings are available to mortals in the first place. After all, if Ikonn is a Doctor Strange villain, why does Strange invoke him to use spells? I said earlier that the basic established spells invoking the Octessence are pretty accessible. If you want to use a lot of their power, then you're gonna have to make a deal or become an exemplar or whatever, but their standard spells can be used by anyone who learns them at any time. These spells do not come with a direct trade-off or price associated with them. We know this from Agatha Harkness, who would be a reliable source on the subject, talking directly about Valtorr, a member of the Octessence who we'll be discussing later. She says that each time Valtorr was entreated, those gifts were given freely. She then continues, though, explaining that while there is not a direct price, there is a cost that is more subtle and implied. The powers given by the Octessence for these simple spells are quite useful, and by using them repeatedly, you are consciously or unconsciously building up some sort of reliance on them. As she says, a little wisp of its power could be so overwhelming and corrosive. Basically, the idea here is that the spells of the Octessence, especially the more evil members, are kind of like a free trial of what their power could be. They are extra-dimensional entities who often need human agents to operate on Earth, so by putting little tiny bits of their magic out into the world that anyone could use, then maybe some more reckless and gullible people will try to contact the Octessence directly and new warlocks can be made. If you are a reasonably intelligent guy like Doctor Strange, then you can fire off Octessence spells as much as you want because you know the cost of what happens if you go too hard on it. But if you are not following that logic, like, as you can probably guess, certain members of Agatha Harkness's coven when it came to Valtorr, then things are going to go badly for you very fast. It is worth noting, though, that your ability to use these spells can be cut off from either side of the deal. There have been cases where members of the Octessence will twist their spells when they're being used by somebody that they don't like, and in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme issue 49, a bunch of Principalities are trying to trap Stephen, and he escapes them by basically severing his connection to all of their energies, escaping, but at the cost of him not being able to use Principality spells for a while. Now, those are just the general rules for why those spells and abilities work and who exactly can use them. Magic is obviously a very weird and twisty and often inconsistent thing, and as I've said a few times, the Principalities are all different beings. They can operate on slightly different rules between them because they set those rules for themselves. This is, more than anything else, a segment that I wanted to do because I know people would have the question, why does Doctor Strange use spells from obviously evil guys? And that's your general answer, more or less. Now let's get back to the Octessence members. Now moving on, we reach Farallah, who I admittedly don't have a lot of pictures of. Farallah does have lore, but doesn't make appearances. He's only been shown in about 2 panels, much like Balthakk. Farallah's domain of power is pretty clear from the being's full name, which is Farallah of the Hunt. This is an entity of hunting, of ferocity, beasts and monsters, things like that. The exemplar artifact that this being uses is called the Fearsome Fist of Farallah, and it is another one of the artifacts that causes a more notable physical change in the person using it. The man who would become this exemplar was named Andreas Zorba, and Zorba was one of the few exemplar members who actually existed as a villain before the 8th Day storyline. Originally, he was a Black Panther foe from the 70s, and in this original role, he was an aristocrat, Count Zorba to be specific. His whole thing was that he hunted down magical artifacts to add them to his own collection. You kinda get the type. He was a pretentious magic rich dude. Upon touching the Fearsome Fist, though, Zorba was immediately transformed into a much more animalistic state, compared on the page to people like Wolverine and Sabretooth. In this state, he was known as Carnivore, and his personality changed quite a bit. I don't think I need to lay this out any more clearly for you. It is very straightforward. Become a warlock of the god of the hunt, and you get transformed into a bestial predator guy. It is obvious, but it's interesting because it is the only one of the exemplar artifacts that works in this kind of way. Carnivore aside, perhaps the most interesting part of Farallah's magical kit is his signature spells, though. He has 2 of them, the first of which being called the Fangs of Farallah. The form factor of this spell is very obvious. You summon some big magical fangs and they bite through whatever you want. But the keyword that makes this one a lot crazier is whatever you want, because that's very literal. The Fangs of Farallah can be used to bite through anything. Physical matter, energy, even space-time. You can use this spell as a way to hop dimensions by just chomping a hole from one into another. Cool as that spell may be in concept, it is not the being's more popular invocation. The other one is the reason that the name Farallah might be ringing a bell in your head. This spell is the Pentagram of Farallah. First off, let's address the weirdness about the theming here. First off, Pentagram of Farallah does not have any alliteration, which almost all the other ones do, and also, Farallah's not really a demon, at least not in the traditional pentagram associated sense. But whatever, that's what the spell's called. I don't really have a justification for why it's called that, it just is. That aside, though, what the Pentagram of Farallah spell actually is a portal creation spell. This is the comic's reason why Doctor Strange can teleport to a bunch of places. He doesn't really use a sling ring, at least not nearly as much. That was an MCU creation. Pentagram of Farallah is his teleportation thing, and it's also what his teleportation ability is called in Marvel Rivals. Now, this is not a Marvel Rivals video. There's going to be a couple references here and there just because Rivals is popular, but that's not the main topic. Regardless, though, I absolutely had to mention this. A lot of you who play the game have heard Strange say Pentagram of Farallah while opening his portal, and this is who he's referencing. Now, the theming is still a little bit weird. It does feel kind of odd at first that a god of the hunt would provide a portal spell, but I guess the logic behind it is probably being able to track down your target wherever they may be. You can hunt them by simply opening a portal to their location so you become inescapable, and I guess that makes enough sense. Now, with Farallah addressed, we are entering the top half of the Octessence, the members who have had the most relevance to comics in one way or another. Though the next one is also not a being who appears on the page too often. Much like Farallah, this one is relevant because of the things that he has done and items and spells he has created. This being is Watoomb, unique among the Octessence because this is the only member who began life as a mortal. Interesting as that opening pitch is, unfortunately, we don't know too much about Watoomb's mortal life. We know that he was mortal, and there have been a couple lines which imply that he is an alien and not a human, but other than that, that's really all I can tell you about his early days. At some point in his early life, Watoomb learned enough about magic and gained enough personal power that he ascended to being a principality, and in his principality form, he is a deity of weather. His main signature spell is the Winds of Watoomb, which can be used as an attack or defensive thing, much like any versatile wind spell, but most iconically, it is used as a transportation ability. The Winds of Watoomb let people fly. Keeping up the elemental theming, Watoomb's exemplar artifact was called the Waterfall of Watoomb, and his exemplar, Tempest, had control over storms, air, water, etc., though also limited control over nature and earth, though that was not seen nearly as often. There are lines which imply Watoomb has control over all of nature, but most of the time it's just weather. And at the end of the day, the Waterfall of Watoomb doesn't really matter that much, because Watoomb's abilities are more accessible than those of other members of the Octessence, not really because he actively wants the powers to be available, at least not as far as I'm aware, but more because he has made a lot of magical artifacts. In addition to the Waterfall, there's also the Eye of Watoomb, the Scrolls of Watoomb, the Grimoire of Watoomb, and something called the Warhead of Watoomb, which has only been offhand mentioned once. However, all of those pale in comparison to the Wand of Watoomb. Many of you have probably seen or heard of this one before because it shows up in a lot of different media. It's in comics, it's in video games. Most iconically, it was the weapon of choice that Wong wielded in the MCU for a couple of scenes. The Wand of Watoomb is clearly important and powerful if it shows up in so many places. So what does the wand actually do? Well, it has the power to... historically, it has the power to move the plot along. Yeah, the Wand of Watoomb just kinda does whatever it needs to for any given storyline. It's a magical artifact that does magical things. The main reason, all bits aside, why it shows up in so many places is that it looks cool and has pretty recognizable iconography. As for its actual abilities, the wand is very unspecific. It is an artifact that Marvel uses when they need a generic magical artifact to show up in things. It does so many different unconnected things that I'm not even going to bother listing them all, and few of them directly have to do with Watoomb's actual domain, which is, again, weather. But weirdly, I'm kind of okay with Watoomb being another artifact guy in context. I highly doubt that this was the writing intent based on how many different comics it took place across, but it did work out pretty nicely that the mortal ascended to godhood is the one who makes a bunch of magical items that can be found in the mortal realm. Maybe he made them before he became a principality and they're still connected to him, or even as a god, he is invested in the affairs of mortals and makes these artifacts for them specifically. That is not official canon, at least not anywhere I can find, but I don't know, it makes sense, and so in the absence of anything official, that's what I'm gonna go with. Entering the top 3, we have a nice change of pace, finding something that we have not seen for quite a while, a member of the Octessence who is also an actual character on the page, like a real villain that people fight directly. The last one of those was Ikonn, and Ikonn was a one-off villain from decades ago. The next member, Krakkan, is also a one-off villain, but a one-off villain from a lot more recently. Krakkan is... Well, Krakkan first off looks horrifying. This is probably just a function of him appearing in a recent comic where the art style leans more into horror, but still, this guy is pointy. His domain, though, is a lot harder to piece together. For most of the Octessence members up to this point, their domains, even if not explicitly stated, are pretty easy to figure out. All of their powers more or less revolve around a certain theme, but Krakkan's different powers and artifacts and the like don't have as strong of a connection. He does have some theme explicitly stated. He is called Krakkan the Jailer, and his signature spell does line up with this. That spell is called the Chains of Krakkan, and it is another binding spell, the second in the Octessence after the Rings of Raggador. So he's a jailer, he's like a demon of imprisonment or something, but then you go back and look at his exemplar from the 8th Day storyline, and that comic handles Krakkan entirely differently. Krakkan's magical artifact is called the Kestrel Key of Krakkan. So a key for a lock that kind of lines up with the jailer thing, but then when an exemplar was actually empowered, that exemplar's name was Conquest, and her power was that she could summon like 1,000,000 guns and weapons at will, and also she's referred to as the living embodiment of battle and the warrior exemplar. Conquest is definitely some sort of battle warlock, that is very clear, because she never shuts up about it, but that is difficult to blend with Krakkan's other theme of imprisonment. You could kind of try to reach a midpoint of the two and call Krakkan a demon of war or something, but I didn't really love that answer, so I began digging deeper. Diving deeper into obscure and dated, but still technically canon Marvel handbooks than I ever have before, I managed to find one offhand line about Krakkan in regards to his home dimension, which gave me some info I needed. One thing I have not mentioned about the Octessence up to this point is that they do all technically rule their own little pocket dimensions. The reason I haven't brought this up is that it very rarely ever matters. Really, only one of the Octessence home realms has any effect on canon, and oh boy, we are going to be getting to that later in the video. But this one offhand mention of Krakkan's realm says that it is an imprisonment realm for enemies of the Octessence, and is basically hell. It is a realm of torment. With this in mind, I started forming a more complex theory about Krakkan. We know his domains are battle and imprisonment and also torment, so maybe he's like a justice god, like a sort of cosmic punisher, taking the unrighteous and unworthy and putting them in his hell realm. Obviously, he is a bad guy, I mean, look at his design, but he could have a sort of cosmic, twisted sense of justice where all humans are deserving of torment. And then I looked at that design one more time and realized maybe I am vastly overthinking this, and Krakkan is just the god of pain. His spell is chains, his home realm is a torment jail, and his exemplar summons a bunch of guns and weapons to beat the shit out of people. Also, he is covered in spikes like he's something out of Hellraiser. I think I was just way overshooting this. I bet Krakkan is the pain demon. I don't love that answer, and I admittedly took way too long to get there, but I think that it is fine. For all intents and purposes, Krakkan is a pain demon. We're just gonna go with that. Weird obscure lore aside, I did promise that Krakkan was somewhat relevant in current comics, so let's actually talk about his storyline briefly. It does only take place over one issue, but it is kind of a cool one. Krakkan was an ancient enemy of the immortal monster hunter Ulysses Bloodstone, father of Elsa Bloodstone, who I already have a whole video on this channel, so if you want to learn more about her, you can go check that out. By sacrificing both a magical artifact called the Null Gem along with his own daughter, Ulysses exiled Krakkan to a pocket dimension prison, ironically, and trapped him there for a very, very long time. Evidently, Krakkan's power, or at least tiny pieces of it, were still able to reach out from that prison into the mortal realm, but most of his energy was contained. However, this arrangement was actively maintained by the sacrifices that Ulysses had made. The Null Gem and his daughter Lyra were still around, also exiled, and if they ever returned to the mortal realm, then Krakkan's imprisonment would break and he would be returned too. This continued into the modern day, where maintenance and upkeep of this spell was maintained by the Sorcerer Supreme, at the time Doctor Strange. And then Doctor Strange died without passing his title down to another Sorcerer Supreme, meaning there was no protector for a time, and a bunch of his protection spells dissipated. This is the whole point of the big Death of Doctor Strange crossover from a few years back, and in the Elsa Bloodstone tie-in to this event, Lyra Bloodstone and Krakkan come back to the mortal realm. It is a pretty quick comic. Most of Krakkan's appearance here is just a big fight scene with the Bloodstone family, but at the end of it, he is seemingly destroyed, his magical energies being consumed by Lyra Bloodstone. As much as this looks like the end for Krakkan though, he is an extra-dimensional entity, and the book does specifically use the word destroyed, not killed. So it would be very easy for a future Marvel writer to say that his avatar or aspect on the mortal plane was destroyed, and the real Krakkan is just in his home prison realm and can return later once he recovers enough strength. So if you really want to be a Warlock of the Pain God in the Marvel Universe, you can probably still try to do that. I don't recommend it, but whatever you're into, there is a panel where they refer to the Chains of Krakkan spell as the sultry Chains of Krakkan for some reason. I'm not going to touch that one. And speaking of things that you certainly do not want to touch, how about a Demon of Decay? Most of the other Octessence members could be survivable Warlock deals. They might suck and they might have drawbacks, but they are something that you can work around. But if you make a deal with the god Valtorr, that is going to kill you one way or another. We'll just go ahead and start with his exemplar because that illustrates the point pretty clearly. The exemplar artifact used by Valtorr is called the Verdant Vial, and the guy transformed by the Verdant Vial, he kills anything he touches immediately. Anything remotely close to him that he makes contact with, it will instantly decay into nothingness. He does not have control over this, it just happens. Also, his name is just Decay. They weren't really creative with that one. This ability makes Decay, and by extension any other Warlocks of Valtorr, extremely dangerous, but really only in the right situation. He is one of those characters that is incredibly strong, but only at close range. Decay has no long-range abilities whatsoever. He needs to touch you. If he touches you, it's game over. But if you have magical powers, it shouldn't be that difficult to just keep him from touching you. If you want to use Valtorr powers in a way that is a little bit more practical though, like the other members of the Octessence, Valtorr also has signature spells. He has 2 of them, and unexpectedly, they're kind of hilarious. The first spell is not that funny on its own. It is the Vapors of Valtorr. This spell always looks like a black cloud of fog or smoke, but the actual uses of it kind of depend on what comic you're reading. Sometimes it is a poisonous decaying cloud, other times it is just an obscuring fog like a darkness spell, and on a few occasions it's had lightning powers like a storm cloud for some reason. So that one is simple if a little bit varied in uses, but the other spell is the Vipers of Valtorr. He has the Vapors, and he has the Vipers, which feels like somebody just kind of said the wrong word when they were casting the spell, and somehow it worked. The Vipers of Valtorr does exactly what you think it does. It just summons a couple of magical snakes that then attack whoever you point them at. It is not a complicated spell, and even though it has never been canonically stated, I am choosing to believe that somebody just got the spell wrong, and this is what came out of it. I'm pulling a classic superhero move and cutting in here late in the editing process with another fun fact. I decided after most of this video was already recorded that I wanted to go back and watch the Doctor Strange movies to see if any of these spells are referenced, and of all things, I totally forgot that the Vipers of Valtorr are used in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I have mixed feelings about the way that this movie approaches Doctor Strange as a character, but I cannot deny that the Easter eggs and references are great. This spell looks right off the pages of the comic, and I do have to give it credit for that. That rules. So Valtorr powers seem very fun in moderation. Become a warlock of him and it's definitely going to be the end of you because you're serving a decay god, but occasional vapors and vipers now and again, that's a funny thing to do to your enemies. Except, you can't do that anymore, at least not directly, because Valtorr is dead. Not a Krakkan situation where he is nebulously destroyed. We have seen his corpse on the page. In current canon, Valtorr is not around anymore. This has to do with that Agatha Harkness plotline that I mentioned a while ago, as revealed in 2023's Midnight Suns miniseries. Remember, I said that Agatha talked about the price of invoking the Octessence, and how it's not a direct cost, but can go badly if you overuse it. At some point in the past, Agatha and her coven did overuse invocations of Valtorr, going beyond the powers that are available to everyone and asking so much of the entity that he came to collect payment in return. That payment was a member of the coven named Karina, who Valtorr kidnapped and took back to his home as a prisoner. This ultimately proved to be a very bad move, though, as it's well established that members of the Octessence are arrogant. I mean, their original debut storyline was them fighting each other just because they all thought that they were the best. And members of Agatha Harkness's coven had a specialty in stealing magical power from others. After spending so long in Valtorr's realm, Karina became used to his specific magical signature, getting corrupted by it in the process and turning into an evil decay being herself, but also being able to combine that power with her knowledge from Agatha and usurp Valtorr as leader of his realm. In this corrupted state, she became known as Corrosion, and while Corrosion was defeated by the Midnight Suns, she survives the encounter and I think is still around. She has not appeared after Midnight Suns, but her last panel in the series does show her taking a seat on Valtorr's throne, and the caption box literally says Valtorr's realm, but the name Valtorr is crossed out and replaced with Corrosion. So I guess she has also ascended to being a principality and is presumably now a member of the Octessence too, though I can't be sure. And with that, 7 out of 8 members of the Octessence have been covered, and the only one remaining is far and away the most relevant to Marvel as a whole. In fact, really the only one who has major effects on canon, a character that I probably could have made an entire video about if I really wanted. This is the god that empowers Juggernaut, known as Cyttorak. Before I talk about Cyttorak, though, we need to briefly discuss Juggernaut and how both of these characters relate to the timeline of the Octessence, as Juggernaut is an old character. He first debuted in X-Men number 12 from 1965, long before any Octessence storylines had been established. Somewhat surprisingly, if you're new to X-Men lore, Juggernaut being a magical character is not a retcon. All the way back in his first appearance, he was not a mutant, he was just a regular human who found a magical crystal and was empowered by that. So yes, Juggernaut has always been a warlock in D&D terms. Juggernaut's real name is Kane Marco, and he was a soldier in the Korean War. During a battle, he deserted his unit and fled to safety in a nearby cave that happened to contain a temple. And that temple contained the Gem of Cyttorak. Yes, the name Cyttorak is mentioned even in this early X-Men comic. Upon touching it, he was granted the powers of the god and turned into Juggernaut immediately. Now, other than just being a nebulous god, Cyttorak's lore is not really defined here. We know he's magic, that's pretty much it. The later 8th Day storyline with the rest of the Octessence was Marvel and Kurt Busiek just kind of extending on this concept. If there was one magical warlock artifact out there, maybe there could be others. It does raise a question, though. If you think back to earlier, I said that the Octessence War was supposed to be started approximately at the same time for all involved parties. Once one person got their hands on an artifact, all the other exemplars would be drawn to theirs as well. And Juggernaut got his well before the rest of them, so how were they going to explain that plot hole? I honestly did not expect that there would be an explanation for this. I kind of just thought that they would hand wave it away. But no, shockingly, there is an explanation for why Juggernaut activated so early, and it makes a weird amount of sense. These comics establish that the spells which activated the other exemplars once the first one was chosen were not placed on the artifacts themselves, and were rather placed on the surrounding areas. All the artifacts were contained within various temples, and those temples contained the activation spells. It is clearly shown in X-Men 12 that when Cain Marko flees into the Temple of Cyttorak, he's doing so because the area is getting bombed, and those bombs damaged the temple, deactivating the magical sigils which should have activated the other exemplars. I can find no fault with that explanation, actually. That's how you do a retcon if you have to do one. It does show on the panel that there were bombs, so just use those bombs decades later as part of the canon. Excellent example of working with the past. So now the question is, what does Cyttorak do? What is his domain? What powers does he provide? A lot of you probably know the basics of this, but as is fairly common in magic lore, there are two answers, a long and a short one. We will begin with the short. The easier explanation is that Cyttorak is a god of motion, but interestingly, not motion in terms of speed. Cyttorak is not a Speed Force type situation. His power deals more with movement in the terms of power and force. Look at Juggernaut again as an example. Juggernaut's main ability is that if he moves, he becomes unstoppable. If he builds momentum, he is the only one that can end said momentum. This is because he's taking that power from the god of movement. Nobody else has higher authority over his moves, and so nobody else can make them end. This can also work in reverse. Cyttorak can revoke a being's right to movement if he so chooses. This is what his signature spell is all about. The Crimson Bands of Cyttorak are yet another binding spell, for one, the third in the set of the Octessence alone, but in this case they make the most sense thematically. The way that I like to think of the spell is that the restraints it creates are not like physical objects, and are instead regions of space where the power of Cyttorak has disabled movement. Therefore, it kind of works like solid barriers because nothing can go in or out. So that's the easy explanation, and the signature spell as well. But in recent years especially, Cyttorak's lore has been expanded a ton in, of all things, a Spider-Man comic? The recent arc 8 Deaths of Spider-Man has Peter Parker fighting this god's kids, called the Scions of Cyttorak, and their powers get way more esoteric. Also, given that name, I'm going to address the pronunciation really quickly. There seem to be multiple official pronunciations of this entity's name. Different Marvel media has used both Cyttorak and Cyttorak at different times. I'm saying Cyttorak in this video because that's more common among fans, but technically either is correct. Anyway, the children of Cyttorak all possess individual fragments of their father's domain. Some of them are pretty obvious aspects of a movement power. There's a scion of gravity, there's a scion of space, etc. But other ones are movement in a lot more conceptual or metaphorical way. Bridging the gap between the normal and the metaphorical, one of the scions has power over time, but specifically inevitability of time. Time as a constant march forward that cannot be stopped. Then we get to like minor Greco-Roman god levels of specificity with Cyttorak's twin children, whose powers are specifically the inevitability of pain and the inevitability of death. Not just pain and death, like the unescapable nature of them. That's what their power is about. This is really cool, and it also drastically expands the concept of motion in terms of Cyttorak's abilities. Yes, he controls physical movement, but also unstoppability in terms of certainty, like the nature of human existence and even narrative, things that are approaching and cannot be halted. That too is motion where Cyttorak is concerned. Which is awesome, I love that idea, but wow, we've just added like 10 new layers to how this guy works. Interesting as all of that is, it hasn't really been referenced too much going forward, simply because that happened in a recent storyline. 8 Deaths of Spider-Man only happened last year, and I do recommend reading it if the idea of Magic Spider-Man intrigues you. It has a bunch of fun moments and is also a really good character study on Peter Parker, specifically in the context of all the suffering he's experienced over his life and why he continues being Spider-Man despite it all. Another fun bit of Cyttorak lore from this arc that is not incredibly important, but definitely something I want to mention, is that we see some Cyttorak minions. He has more underlings than a lot of the other Octessence members do. One of the scions of Cyttorak controls these little monster dogs. A book shortly before this had energy beings that were essentially weaker versions of the Juggernaut, and at one point a couple years before that, Dr. Voodoo cast a spell to summon these little Cyttorak golems, which will apparently build or repair buildings for you. Not really a Cyttorak thing, but fun that that's apparently one of the spells in his kit. And where might these minions be summoned from, you might be asking? Because I did promise earlier in the video that exactly one Octessence home dimension mattered to the lore. And we've reached it. Here we go. Let's talk about the Crimson Cosmos, or as some people refer to it occasionally, the Punch Dimension. The Crimson Cosmos on its own is very simple lore-wise. It is an extra-dimensional space where Cyttorak and his underlings reside. Usually it is depicted as a red, sometimes purplish void, occasionally with floating islands or magical temples in there. Now let's pivot entirely. Cyclops, popular Marvel character, frequent field leader of the X-Men. His mutant ability is that his eyes are portals to another dimension that contains pure force and kinetic energy. This is slowly becoming more common knowledge, but Cyclops' eye beams are not actually heat vision, they are just kinetic force. He's basically punching you from range. You can probably figure out where exactly I am going with this. It is commonly believed that the dimension Cyclops' eye portals lead to is the Crimson Cosmos, but I do have to put some disclaimers on that, so don't go freaking out quite yet. This connection has never been explicitly stated in lore. It is purely a fan theory, and I usually don't cover fan theories on this channel, but in this case, come on, that connection is the easiest layup Marvel could ever do, and I'm amazed they haven't canonized it yet. We do know that Cyclops' eyes go to a force dimension, and the Crimson Cosmos is a bright red dimension controlled by a god of kinetic force who also happens to have an iconic connection to one of the most popular X-Men villains in the Juggernaut. Why has Marvel not just made this official? I have absolutely no idea, because it works on multiple levels, both mechanically and in terms of narrative. It's perfect. The only reason that I have to maybe suggest is that Marvel doesn't like the punch dimension as a concept. It is canon, and has been canon for a while, that Cyclops' eyes are portals. That is how his powers work. And yet Marvel Editorial, for reasons that I do not know, does not like acknowledging it. The punch dimension is more of a fan term, and it has kind of been pseudo-canon, something that was said a while ago and is still technically true, but that Marvel writers seemingly just are not allowed to reference. But Marvel Rivals apparently is allowed to acknowledge it, because the punch dimension is explicitly mentioned in the current season. This is the reason why you might have seen discourse around the punch dimension come up lately. Rivals made it a plot point. The reason why Scott got captured by Alchemax is they are forcing him to act like a gateway battery by opening to the punch dimension. And the punch dimension is mentioned by name specifically. I don't know how they got that past Marvel. I cannot imagine the comics editors are happy about it. But Marvel Rivals is under Marvel Games, which is technically a different department, so they managed to sneak it in, I suppose. And now Rivals, because I do know for a fact that you watch my videos, and I apparently will exploit that at every opportunity to talk to you directly, just canonize it as the Crimson Cosmos. You're right there. Just take one more step, make that connection official. Myself and a lot of other fans would thank you for it. With that, we've covered all the lore on Cyttorak's powers directly that I would like to discuss, but since Cyttorak is the most important of the Octessence, it's worth spending a couple minutes on how exactly you gain that power, because with Cyttorak being more important to storylines, his power is also far more accessible to the average guy. Cain Marko became a Warlock of Cyttorak by touching the Crimson Gem, sometimes called the Crimson Crystal, same thing. But interestingly, there are multiple Crimson Gems out there, at least 8 of them, and they can be used at the same time. In current canon, there are multiple Juggernauts out there, Cain Marko Juggernaut, and Justin Jin, who is simply named, Kid Juggernaut. And weirdly, both of them are heroes. Cyttorak is a more evil-leaning god, though some recent comics have humanized him a little bit and made him more morally gray. But that said, when he empowers avatars, he wants them to go be bad guys. Cyttorak empowers people so that they cause chaos and destruction in his name. That's why he liked Cain Marko originally. Right now, Kid Juggernaut is using the powers heroically, but Cyttorak has some long-term plan for him that's going to work out in the god's favor. We don't know exactly what that is yet. Kid Juggernaut is a relatively recent character, but apparently he has some destructive destiny on the horizon. Cain Marko currently is a member of the main X-Men. He's had a huge redemption arc over a better part of the last decade, and the reason that he is using Cyttorak's powers heroically is it's a hell of a thing. He has gained and lost the powers as his favor with Cyttorak changes many times over the decades, but most recently, Cyttorak stripped his powers from him because Cain was not being as destructive as the god would like. So Cain sought out a physical version of the Crimson Bands of Cyttorak spell and kind of wielded it as armor to regain a partial portion of his Juggernaut abilities. That's not the weirder part, though. The weirder part is that he regained his full abilities by seeking out one of the Crimson Gems, smashing it into powder, and then snorting it. He inhaled the crystal dust, and it gave him the full Juggernaut powers again, permanently not under Cyttorak's control. So, that's an apparently canon way to become a Warlock of Cyttorak. If you can crush and snort the crystal. Now, it does take a lot of power to do that. That is not something that can be achieved by normal means, but just the fact that that worked. Comics are weird, and I love them. And the larger lore lesson from that absolutely insane plot point is that it is further proof people can wield Octessence powers without being their direct minions. You're going to start as a minion if you go through a normal Warlock-style deal, but you can break out of it and then use those powers however you like if you have the willpower and resources to achieve that. Granted, not a lot of people actually try this. Becoming a Warlock or Exemplar requires you to either find one of the Octessence artifacts or know the spells necessary to contact them directly. It isn't really a beginner trick, and so there are not a lot of Octessence-powered people running around in current canon. Though, speaking of which, what did happen to the rest of the Exemplars? Juggernaut is obviously still around, but as for the other 7, since their original arc in the 90s, they have only appeared one more time. It was in a single issue of a Black Knight comic from 2015, and they were just stock villains for like 1 or 2 pages, mostly used so that Black Knight would have somebody to kill. He murders Carnivore, and the only reason the Exemplars are here is that murdering one of them wouldn't really have an effect on the narrative. They got used as cannon fodder. So I don't really expect them to be super relevant going forward, but who knows? If Cyttorak can be a villain in a Spider-Man comic, I have no idea what could happen. Exemplars aside, though, I do know that the Octessence powers are still very relevant. At least most of them. I guess people are probably going to be invoking Corrosion instead of Valtorr, but regardless, the Octessence and many other Principalities are named and occasionally seen in current comics. They represent an area of Marvel magic that I find fascinating, which is the underlying foundation of it all that we rarely get to see. Marvel's magic systems are defined a little bit, but not very strictly, which I do think is a good thing. There are a lot of ways to gain magical power, sorcery, witchcraft, other methods, but the lines between them are intentionally left vague. Marvel magic is kind of just a big ball of wibbly-wobbly magic-wagic stuff. But the Octessence and other principalities can act like an entry point into that world. If you desperately need magical power and you need it fast, invoke one of their names, taking on some risk to yourself, but risk that is directly proportional to how much you abuse it. Become a Warlock of Cyttorak and you may be forced to destroy. Become a Warlock of Valtorr or Corrosion and it may kill you outright. And perhaps worst of all, become a Warlock of Balthakk and no one will be able to take you seriously ever. But like all good magical deals, the risk-reward is what makes that interesting, and I hope that future comics show us more people taking that risk. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, I hope you enjoyed, and to the Marvel Rivals players especially, bet you weren't expecting the Punch Dimension lore drop in this video, huh? Sometimes even my seemingly random topics actually have a lot of thought put into when I release them. I'll keep my announcements and plugs and such quick. Main one, as usual, I have a Patreon. If you go and check that out, you can find early and ad-free access to all of my videos, as well as a Patreon exclusive video every month. There's over 7 hours of exclusive content on there and counting. My username there is the exact same as it is here. There's also a link to that in the description of this video and on my channel page. It's very easy to find. And extra double thank you to everyone who already supports me over there. It really does help me keep making these videos for you guys. Also, shout out to Ruben Perez, the artist I work with for these videos. He drew the poses of the character that's been talking at you for the last hour or so. Go check out his other work if you have a chance. And now, man, I am so glad to finally be done with this video's recording. This one turned out a lot longer than I expected it to, but I guess that tracks that the video ending with Cyttorak just kinda got going and then didn't stop. I should have expected it. That one's on me.